August 1944. A runway at Reckland turned silver in the thin morning light while a blue shape waits under hangar eaves. Wings kink like a seabird, nose long and purposeful, canopy glinting. The stopwatch on a kneeboard is set to 0. A German test pilot has been handed exactly one sortie to answer a single problem. Why do aircrews from the other side keep insisting this machine can pick its fights, leave when it wants, and come back before anyone can reset? 45 minutes to replace rumour with numbers. The airplane's path here was unlikely. Weeks earlier over occupied Norway, a Royal Navy pilot brought this very Corsair down on rough ground rather than trust heavy seas. The landing gear absorbed more punishment than it had any right to, the canopy slid back, and the pilot moved quickly, radio smashed, papers burned, yet ground troops reached the field before the airframe could be silenced. What stood in the grass was not a wreck but a prize. An F4U with a raised seat line and the famously bent wing that let a huge prop clear a deck while keeping the gear short and strong. Local staff knew trucking it south would take forever. Flying it was out of the question with the fuel system damaged. So it went by ship, lashed to deck through bad weather, then on rails through a country rattled by sirens. 18 days of improvisation brought the Corsair to this place. Salt stains on fasteners, a faint dullness at the edges of paint, but completely repairable. Inside Hangar 7, the pre-flight checklists were methodical and quiet. A small maintenance team had flush lines, replaced valves with fabricated equivalents, and inspected the big radial for salt intrusions. They had seen captured aircraft before, a Spitfire with delicate elliptical wings, a Thunderbolt that felt like it had been carved from an ingot, but nothing with this exact geometry. Inverted gull wings tucked the landing gear into short, rigid bays. Tail surfaces were broad. Elevators sat with the calm of something that didn't need theatrics to be fast. The pilot approached with the walk of someone who studies metal like it speaks. He had flown dozens of types and had an unromantic reputation. Praise when deserved, blunt edges when the design asked too much of a human being. He circled the Corsair once without touching, tracing seams with his eyes. The raised canopy line of this variant promised better forward view than early production, and the instrument panel, seen through the glass, looked ordered rather than glamorous, a grid of clear numerals and sturdy switches. The gull wing design still puzzled him. You could see the naval thinking baked into the structure, the way mass was distributed to land hard and go again without complaint. He paused at the leading edge gun ports. 6.50 caliber routes to a single centerline sight picture meant long-firing windows at speed. Ammunition loads were deep enough to fight without rationing short bursts. He knew the counter-arguments by rote, that heavier cannon rounds do more per hit, but the Corsair's trick would be platform stability in a dive, not individual projectile mass. A stable sight at 400 knots solves problems brute force cannot. A clock ticked over in the tech office. The brief was simple. Climb performance, acceleration, vertical recovery, energy retention, high-speed handling, slow-speed handling, visibility effects, stability during fire.
No aerobatic choreography. No aerial theatrics.
The pilot's job was to decide how the Corsair would be used by someone who understood it, and how to make sure opponents didn't let that happen. He climbed up the port side, stepped onto the wing root, and slid into the seat. The cockpit was higher than he was used to, the control stick centered rather than offset, the throttle quadrant heavy in the hand. He took a moment with the panel. The layout was intuitive. Engine gauges grouped, flight instruments in a tight crosscheck, gun controls where muscle memory could find them under stress. There was no jeweled craftsmanship, just clarity. He adjusted the shoulder straps until they felt like architecture rather than cloth. Out on the line, the wind was barely a suggestion. The starter cart coughed. Then 18 cylinders of the double wasp rolled over, caught, and settled into that deep radial thrum that feels like someone wheeling a generator the size of a building. The airplane quivered not with nervousness but with contained energy. He eased the throttle to warm, checked magnetos, scanned temperatures, and began the taxi. Immediately the practical quirk made itself known. The nose was so long that the world ahead vanished. You weaved gently left-right to see. He had been told of this and had practiced the serpentine motion long ago in other types. The brakes were firm but not touchy. The tail swung obediently, ready to align with asphalt the second he asked. At the threshold he held the brakes, advanced the throttle to take off power, and felt the push begin in his lower back before the gauge needle fully agreed. Release. The Corsair surged, tail up almost at once, runway center line sliding toward him fast. At a speed he knew by feel rather than number, he drew back. The machine lifted without ceremony and climbed as if the earth had let go of a rope. A few minutes later, the field had shrunk from detail to patchwork. He leveled at a low step altitude just long enough to feel the controls without loading them. The roll response was honest and weighty. The airplane didn't wobble, it moved. Pitch held as if on dampers. Rudder authority felt present rather than dominant. He'd flown turns with flight school politeness in captured types. Here he found something different. The Corsair told the pilot to make decisions early and commit to them. He pushed the throttle forward and watched the speed build. Numbers that would typically arrive reluctantly showed up without drama. He eased it back, not because the aircraft protested, but because the test card wanted order. The stopwatch remained still on his kneeboard, but he already understood a baseline. This airplane would not struggle to be where it wanted to be. The question, then, became whether it could choose how to fight, not just when. The climb test would answer that. He cleared the airspace with the radio, checked the horizon, and fed power while pulling smoothly. The nose rose, the horizon fell, the altimeter spun, and the engine note held steady without the fading some supercharged units produced as air thinned. The sensation was not flamboyant. It was inevitable. He leveled again to note the figure, wrote it down with a pencil stub, and reset the watch. He would try the same trick with more entry speed, and he suspected the numbers would tell a story command would not enjoy hearing. Above him, the sky faded toward a thinner blue. Below, the field's network of runways looked like chalk lines. He rolled inverted, let the nose come through into a controlled dive to gather energy, and then, at a chosen speed, pulled hard, feeling the harness bite and the peripheral world dim to a grey ring. The airframe complained in creaks rather than rattles, the kind of structural torque you hear in a well-built bridge under load. He eased pressure as airspeed bled, waited for the brake, and marked the altitude. Again, he wrote, and the pencil line underlined the same word twice in his mind: vertical. He tested recovery from that nose-high wall, letting the airplane drop its nose and reclaim speed swiftly, then leveled and breathed out. He had been briefed on stories from far seas, how pilots they kept their speed, chose tall entries, and came back up like they were on rails. Up here, far from carriers and island chains, the metal in front of him was telling the same lesson. If you insisted someone fight you slow, this machine would make you pay for the attempt. If you respected what it could do, you'd accept a different kind of fight, one that happened on the clock and the altimeter, not in circles cut across a valley. The stopwatch finally clicked. The next sequence would turn impressions into timing, timing into conclusions, and conclusions into a report some would prefer not to read. He settled into a breathing rhythm pilots use when they expect heavy forces, cleared his head of folklore, and aimed for numbers that would survive an argument. He didn't begin the timing run with a dramatic dive. He began with a standard working altitude, a clean entry speed, and the intent to build a ladder of figures: how long it takes to give away height for an attack, how efficiently the airplane trades that height for effect, and how quickly it returns to the same starting block to do it again. Energy in, result out, energy regained, like measuring a pendulum that can also choose to sprint. The first trial was a pure zoom. Power steady, nose up to a measured angle, no extra theatrics, let the altimeter tell the truth. The Corsair surged into the climb with an eagerness that made the concept of margins feel redefined. He held the pitch and watched the needles. The engine note stayed confident. Cylinder temps remained in sensible territory. The climb rate did not tumble off a cliff with altitude the way he had learned to expect in earlier generations. When the air finally asked too much and the wing whispered its warning, he eased forward, let the nose dip through the horizon, and memorized the top figure before writing it down. He compared it in his head to times he had logged in other types over the same field. The Corsair was not nibbling at an advantage. It was banking one. He rolled into a wide arc to set up the classic dive to attack, pull to vertical, rec limb to perch profile. The stopwatch snapped, and he pressed forward into the dive at an angle appropriate for a fast, stable pass. Speed built quickly. The airframe felt planted even as it vibrated with the air's density. He considered where a pilot would place a short burst, pictured traces converging, then pulled as the mock target slid under the nose. The pull took resolve. The airplane wanted to keep going down. Any heavy fighter does at such speeds, but the stick, the harness, and the pilot's core agreed on a new vector, and the nose rose. The grey at the edges of his vision thickened then retreated as he eased to the climb attitude. Stopwatch. Running. What followed was the sort of cold fact that collapses doctrine. Time to regain lost altitude was shorter than the same run flown in a frontline interceptor he knew well. Not a little shorter, meaningfully shorter. In practical terms, It meant a pilot who played the vertical game with discipline could reappear above a fight before opponents had finished climbing back. Multiply that by a section or flight all working to the same rhythm, and you begin to understand what aircrews across oceans meant when they described an opponent they couldn't pin down. He reset and ran the same pattern with a different entry speed, confirming the trend rather than chasing a single flattering number. Each time, the stopwatch made the argument more forcefully than any adjective could. He imagined an escort mission high over cold territory, where energy conservation and high-altitude performance are everything. In that theater, a machine that can choose to leave, then choose to come back sooner than its pursuer, becomes less a single airplane and more an organizing principle. Next came gun platform behavior at speed. He knew heavy recoil could throw off sight pictures in some types, especially in steep dives where control harmony already felt taxed. He rolled into a 30-degree downslope, aligned a ground reference between the gunsight ring, and pressed the trigger. The 6-gun battery sent a braided rumble down the airframe. The nose barely twitched. It didn't float, it held firm. The sight stayed on the invisible line he had chosen, and the mock target stayed where the mind's pipper wanted it. He tried again at a different speed and slightly steeper angle. Same result. He acknowledged, not for the first time, that raw projectile mass isn't the whole story. Hits are. He moved to a short series of defensive drills, the kind of moves a pilot would make without thinking when surprised. First scenario, an attacker from above, sun at their back. He rolled into a maximum rate break, and the Corsair reminded him of its weight and authority. The turn was solid but not acrobatic. He considered how long a pursuer might hold a solution here and counted in his head. Then he did what discipline demanded. Leveled the wings, pushed the throttle fully, let the speed spike in a shallow descent, and when the needle crossed a number he trusted, pulled into a climbing turn that preserved energy rather than burning it in a frantic flat circle. Separation arrived quickly, not as a flourish but as a practical fact. Distance grew, angles closed in the defender's favor, and the bounce was over without presenting a long target silhouette. Slow speed characterization was next. He squared the horizon and bled speed deliberately, feeling for the cues. Below a certain number, the ailerons grew heavier, the roll rate slowed, and the airplane began to demand forethought for any big change in bank. He raised the nose further and waited for the brake. When it came assertively on one wing, the kind of stall that punishes indecision but rewards a clear, tidy recovery. He fixed it with standard inputs, leveled out, and made a note. Do not let this machine linger slow in a nose-high attitude. It asks for firmness, not drift. Visibility trials told their own story. The raised seating position on this variant did improve the forward picture, yet that long nose still carved out a blind wedge directly ahead and below in certain attitudes. In a turning fight where two aircraft are close and co-altitude, opponents might slide into that shadow and complicate a defender's awareness. But again, that assumed you had been coaxed into a lateral fight in the first place, something a disciplined Corsair pilot would avoid. He checked fuel, scanned engine health, and set up the high-speed dive limit exploration. This required caution. He lowered the nose, let the numbers run toward the upper edge of his card, and felt the controls grow stout as the speed crept into territory where even seasoned pilots plan every exit before they start. The airframe shuddered but did not hint at losing coherence. The stick began to feel like it was moving through honey. He eased the pullout at an altitude cushion he had decided on before the run, then noted the effort required. The conclusion was straightforward. The dive envelope was generous, but like all fast machines, it demanded that pilots think about recovery before they chase one more knot. There were no free gifts at the top of the dial. With the heavy end trials recorded, he returned to the stopwatch exercise one more time, this round with a twist. He imagined a fast pass on a spread-out formation, not to mix inside their circles but to tag an exposed element and leave. He pictured responses below, brake turns fanning out, some trying to chase, and then he counted how long until he would be back, nose down again with options. The answer reinforced the earlier runs. The cycle time favored the Corsair so clearly that any pursuit into a climb was a losing bargain for the chaser. If you didn't chase, the Corsair kept the ladder. If you did, you traded altitude for a dwindling hope and found yourself low and slow with nowhere comfortable to go. By now the pilot had the skeleton of his report in his head. This aircraft is not about winning a circle. It is about deciding whether there will be a circle at all. Its virtues come alive when the pilot refuses to negotiate on speed and height. Its flaws appear only when that discipline slips. Opponents must either force a small radius game early, hard to do against someone alert, or accept that the blue machine above will keep dictating when the next exchange happens. He set a final drill that every evaluation deserves: platform stability with the pilot intentionally busy. He simulated a cluttered cockpit moment, toggling a notional drop tank, glancing at engine temps, checking the watch, and then brought the sight back to a reference point at speed. The airplane forgave the extra workload. It did not wander. In a real fight that meant a pilot could manage fuel and systems without their aim going vague. Satisfied the key boxes were checked, he turned for home, throttling back to cool the engine gently after its exertions. On downwind, he resumed the taxi astern habit in miniature, weaving the nose to keep the field in sight. Touchdown was positive and aligned. The gear, short and stout, accepted the load without drama. He rolled out, let the radial idle down to a purposeful murmur, and then cut mixture. The prop slowed, the blades flashed to a stop, and the world went still. Inside the technical office, he began to write while the sensory details were still warm. His tone was the same he used for every machine: factual, lean, a bit like a metronome. Maximum speed observations. Climb performance in several profiles. Energy retention across attack reclim cycles. Behavior of the gun platform at speed. Slow speed handling and stall character. Visibility notes. Dive recovery loads and margins. Then the part that matters as much as any figure: tactical implications. Do not extend after this aircraft in a pure climb. You will end up slow beneath it. Avoid chasing downhill where it can accelerate away and then reappear high. Force slow, forced perspective engagements if you can. This is the only regime that gives familiar types the advantage they expect. And if you cannot shape that fight, disengage early while you still hold options. He paused, tapped the pencil once, and wrote the line that would be the center of arguments later. In energy-based combat, this aircraft defines the pace. Conventional counter moves are insufficient unless the defender has a significant altitude reserve before the merge. He signed the page, added the time, and underlined the flight duration: 45 minutes. Enough to see what the airframe wanted to tell anyone willing to listen. The technical office smelled faintly of hot oil and pencil shavings. A clerk slid carbon paper under each sheet as he wrote, his words tapping into the page like rivets. He began with the shape of the flight, then moved into data, climb increments, entry speeds, pull-out margins, numbers caged in tidy columns. But the real message lived between the lines. The Corsair did not simply perform well, it rearranged the sequence of choices in a fight. He framed that idea in plain language. The airplane's advantage was not a single headline figure but a system: a large, tolerant engine that held power high in the climb, a wing whose area and stiffness kept the sight steady in a dive, a fuselage robust enough to convert vertical load into altitude without shaking the pilot loose, guns that, though lighter per round than cannon, put more metal on a single point because the platform did not flinch. He emphasized that none of this demanded heroics from the pilot, only discipline. Stay fast. Attack tall. Leave clean. Return before anyone else finishes gasping for speed. Comparison notes came next. Against a contemporary inline fighter, the Corsair's edge at height was obvious. Where a supercharger began to taper, the radial's broad lungs kept feeding. Against a radial-engined opponent, the difference was less about horsepower than about how the airframe wore it. Many machines could run fast. Fewer could use that speed to climb like an elevator after a strike and be patient at the top, waiting to choose again. He wrote a single sentence in that section that the clerk underlined for emphasis: this aircraft banks time. A commander reading it would understand. Cycles, not moments, win or lose a day. He then turned to the human layer. Cockpit ergonomics mattered at altitude when fine motor control begins to stiffen. The Corsair's panel let a pilot check engine temps, scan airspeed and altitude, and bring the sight up without changing posture. This made the airplane less dramatic but more relentless. Pilots flying it would be less inclined to over-control during heavy G or to chase a wandering sight, because the sight did not wander. The cost was clear. At very low speeds the controls grew heavy and the stall could arrive like a trapdoor. If you coaxed this airplane into that corner, it would show you its single bad habit. But the whole design, and the doctrine implied by its strengths, persuaded its pilot never to step into that corner in the first place. He attached a one-page annex, Opponent Guidance. It read like weather rules for a dangerous mountain pass. Do not follow a climbing Corsair unless you hold an altitude cushion of at least 1,500 meters before it starts up. Do not chase a Corsair downhill hoping drag will save you. It will not. If surprised, brake once to spoil a firing line, then either dive decisively to reposition or climb decisively only if you began above. Sliding along co-altitude is an invitation. Try to make the Corsair commit to multiple direction changes below medium speed. Each forced turn is a small tax on energy. 5 such taxes can buy a window. But count honestly. If you are paying more tax than you collect, leave. He requested, almost as an afterthought, 2 exercises for training squadrons, a 3-step ladder drill where defenders practice regaining altitude after defensive break without drifting into a flat turn, and a blind wedge awareness drill to teach pilots to exploit the Corsair's forward blind spot only after it has slowed. These were not boasts. They were lifelines, instruction sets for surviving a meeting with a blue machine that did not care how much you believed in horizontal dogfights. By midday, the report had climbed out of the building. Copies walked briskly down corridors to an operations desk that stamped them and sent them onward. The pilot ate quickly in the canteen, drank coffee that had learned to live with chicory, and returned to the hangar. Mechanics had the Corsair open like a book, panels off, gun bays exposed. The radial idled again to check magneto balance after the heavy runs. One fitter, a quiet man with capable hands, tapped a gusset and raised his eyebrows at the solid ring it returned. Sturdy, he said to no one in particular. The pilot nodded. Robustness sounded like a luxury until you needed to pull 6 times your weight around a clock face and then come back tomorrow to do it again. The afternoon brought the debrief with local leadership. The room held a map, a blackboard, and 2 kinds of silence, the kind that listens and the kind that waits to object. He kept to the data, then gave the short tactical synthesis. The senior officer's first question came not as a challenge but as a test of consistency. If it is so strong vertically, why did stories from earlier in the war claim it bounced on carrier decks? The pilot answered plainly. Early variants sat lower in the cockpit and demanded precision in the groove. This one sat higher and the gear geometry had been made kinder. Aviation is a moving target. Myths expire. A younger officer leaned forward. So you are saying our best move is to refuse? The test pilot shook his head. I'm saying your best move is to choose. You accept a vertical opponent's terms, or you build a scenario where those terms do not apply. Think weather, think terrain, think timing. Catch it during rejoin, when speed is briefly low. Catch it as a section turns for home with fewer light. Deny it the sky it likes. Stack your own sections high so that it never enjoys an unobserved top. Not every answer warms a room, but good answers make it usable. Evening bled into the airfield. The Corsair sat tied down under chocks, its blue paint cooling toward slate. Far down the line, a familiar inline fighter came home with the neat walk of a pilot who has flown exactly to plan. The test pilot watched the landing. That machine, too, had its own kind of beauty, precise, practiced, honed. He felt no disloyalty in admiring the stranger. Recognizing what another design could do did not diminish what his own side had built. It simply inoculated you against surprise. As darkness pressed in, someone from administration handed him a typed notification. Berlin wanted to see the report early. He recognized the handwriting in the margin that had shepherded unpleasant truths through the maze before. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket, then walked back to the hangar for one more look at the airframe he had just taken up and brought home. You learn different things in the air and on the ground. In flight, you feel what the machine wants. On the deck, you sense how it was argued into existence. He traced a finger above a seam so as not to leave a mark. You could, if you looked long enough, decode the design team's conversations. Strong landing gear legs told of carrier decks and the need to plant hard without bending. The kinked wing said prop clearance and reduced drag at the root together, a compromise that solved 3 problems at once. The armament layout spoke a language of simplicity, a single sight line, no convergence math, predictability under stress. The cowl flaps and baffling around the cylinders were pragmatic, not delicate. Engineers had assumed maintenance would happen outdoors in salt air by people with tired hands. None of it made a headline. All of it made a result. When he slept, his dreams weren't of speed tapes and altimeters. They were of ladders you climb 2 rungs at a time and of someone below trying to follow who keeps stepping on a missing rung. The morning would bring phone calls and questions from people with titles. He would say the same thing he had written, because that is the only defense a test pilot has: tell the air's version of events. Berlin's building had polished floors and corridors that turned like questions. The report lay in a neat stack, an officer's pen resting across it as if weight could soften the paragraphs. The room filled with the careful choreography of rank, one man checking his watch, another aligning a pencil with the edge of a blotter, a clerk moving in to pour coffee when eyes glanced up. The first exchange went to the heart of the matter. You claim, said a general staff officer whose tone suggested an audit. A 40% advantage in combat climb over our A-series radial at a typical re-attack profile. That is significant. How certain are you? The test pilot described the setup, the speeds, the stopwatch, and the error bars he could accept. He did not inflate or hedge. He also added the context he always included. A poorly flown Corsair could give that advantage away. A well-flown one would not. Another question targeted armament. 6 half-inch guns are not 4 cannon. The pilot agreed in principle, then described the sight stability at speed and the practical effect on hit probability. If I can keep a bead steady in a fast dive and put 2 seconds of solid fire in one place, he said, the numbers on paper surrender to the holes in aluminum. He did not press the point. People who have seen damaged airframes understand without emphasis. A different voice wanted doctrine. If, hypothetically, such aircraft appeared in numbers here, what would you change first? He answered with deployment rather than hardware. Height discipline, he said. Stack escorts high over vulnerable axes. Train sections to think in cycles, not turns. Drill the break once, then decide habit into muscle memory. And plan interceptions with timing windows when the escort has to choose between staying with their charges or climbing back to their preferred shelf. Punish that choice either way. He paused and then added, and teach your young pilots to recognize when they are being invited downhill for a lesson they do not want. The shape of the invitation will be speed. For a moment, the room acknowledged the answer with silence. Then reality knocked, the kind of reality made of fuel, spares, and the calendar. Someone asked if the Corsair was even likely to appear over their countryside. Probably not in strength, came the measured reply from a logistics officer. But capability denied is not capability erased. The pilot appreciated that sentence. He had spent years watching bad news softened into improbability and then repackaged as reassurance. A precise maybe is better than a confident never. They dismissed him with the courtesy given to a man who had delivered something sharp but necessary. In the hall, a younger captain caught up and walked beside him. I read your notes on that early Thunderbolt, he said. You wrote that it felt like a city wall carried a motor. I like that. The test pilot smiled. This one is a staircase with an engine, he said. If you chase it, you'll get winded on the way up. Back at the field, work continued with the practical hum of early autumn. The Corsair's panels went back on. Safety wire twisted neat silver patterns around fasteners. A second flight would not happen immediately. Once was enough to make the point, and maintenance hours were rationed with the seriousness of a ration card. He walked instead to other test stands where new propellers were being balanced and a prototype cooling flap arrangement on an inline machine was gathering temperature data. Every airplane on the line, friendly or captured, participated in the same experiment. Could an idea become a habit before circumstances changed again? During the next week, he flew local trials in 2 familiar fighters to verify his comparison notes, careful to match weights and weather. The numbers upheld his conclusion. The Corsair's strength was not merely more power, but the way airframe and engine turned power into climb after action. One of the local pilots, a man who loved horizontal contests like a chess player loves forks and pins, listened, then shrugged. We will still outturn it low, he said. Yes, the test pilot replied, if you meet it low. The trick is it rarely does. He ran small classroom sessions with squadron leaders who wanted condensed takeaways, the kind busy people can carry into a briefing. He drew 3 simple diagrams on the board. One was a clean vertical loop showing attack, extension, rec limb, reset. He shaded the rec limb to stress the timing advantage. Another was a horizontal scissor, sketched in red to mark the only place a defender gained edge. He circled the entry, the single moment you had the chance to force it. The third was a cross-section of the Corsair's forward blind wedge in a nose-high turn. Here is your brief window, but only after you've pushed it slow. He finished each session the same way. If you find yourself behind it and it begins to rise, count 4 heartbeats. If you're still pointing up at the 5th, you're buying trouble. Word spread through informal channels, the way useful knowledge always does. Pilots briefed each other before dawn, scribbling notes on map margins, sharing phrases that fit in the head. Brake once and choose, don't buy the ladder, tax its turns, not its dives. None of this changed the inventories in depots or the dates on a calendar, but it made meetings in the sky less surprising. That matters. Surprise is simply physics wearing a disguise. The report, meanwhile, took its own journey. Some copies were filed, Some were annotated by officers who preferred the comfort of past lessons, and one was quietly duplicated by a staffer who believed truths should circulate even when they complicate tidy narratives. Months later, pilots at far-flung fields would nod when someone mentioned a blue fighter with bent wings and a long nose. If it stays tall, don't play, they would say. It didn't make headlines. It made survivals. The test pilot kept flying. 14 more types crossed his logbook before winter, each with its own requests and warnings. A light twin that loved to depart if mishandled in crosswind. A prototype interceptor that sang on the gauge and groaned in structure when asked to do both speed and climb at once. A sturdy short-range fighter that felt wonderfully obedient below 10,000 feet and noticeably less so above. The Corsair remained in the back of his thoughts not because it was mythical but because it was clear. Clarity is rare. Most machines ask for a bargain. This one told you the price up front. Bring discipline and height, and I will give you choices. On a quiet Sunday, he walked the perimeter road and watched gliders practice in the distance. Their pilots, young and precise, traced big patient circles and then long steady lines toward the field. He thought about energy again, the universal currency in the air, whether powered or not. The Corsair simply earned interest at an attractive rate when deposited in climbs. That was the whole story, reduced. He smiled at the vulgarity of that metaphor and forgave himself. Translation is part of the work. Winter would soon bring weather that made high-altitude tests sting the lungs and cake frost on cowl flaps. Reports would grow thicker with caveats about icing and light turbulence. Tactics would adjust to shorter days. None of that would change the notes he had written in August. Machines have personalities, but physics has habits. And every time a pilot anywhere pulled hard at the bottom of a fast pass and felt a big airplane rise as if pulled by a quiet hand, the habits would reassert themselves, and someone would glance at a watch and realize 2 minutes can be an eternity. The next call came not from a desk in the Capitol, but from a frontline wing that had heard whispers about the blue staircase. They wanted a demonstration, not headlines, not theater, just a proof they could feel in their own harnesses. The test pilot agreed on the condition that the mock fight be honest. If one side took a poor entry, the other was free to cash it in. They met at first light, the sky a pale band above a line of poplars. 2 sections launched, a pair of well-flown local fighters and, as a surrogate for the newcomer, a heavy radial bird that could roughly match its climb-to-speed rhythm when kept light. It wasn't a Corsair, and he said so, but the drill would still teach the right lessons, timing at the bottom and patience at the top. They set the floor at 4,000 meters and the lid at 8. First exercise. Escort profile. The Corsair stand-in started high, rolled, and came down clean on a weaving target, then left in a shallow draw to keep the needle moving. The locals did what instinct demanded, poured on throttle and pulled up after it. For 8 seconds the geometry looked promising. By 12, the lines began to open. By 20, the blue surrogate had already begun to arc back upward, curving into a smooth reclim. The pursuers arrived at the bottom with their needles still catching up, looking up through canopies that suddenly felt like aquarium glass. The radio clicks told the story, effort breathing, then rueful laughs. They had chased a mirage of closure, a lesson better learned with blank guns than tracer. Second exercise. Defensive break. The local leader took a bounce from above and did exactly the right thing. 1 sharp cross, not 2, then a firm dip to trade a slice of height for a bank of speed. The surrogate flashed through, too fast to stay, and began to gather itself for the reclim. The defending pair did not follow. They widened in opposite directions and rose just enough to deny an easy re-attack line, then slid back together. Over the intercom, the test pilot marked each decision with a word: choose. The air, indifferent as always, rewarded choices that respected timing. Third exercise. Forced slowdown. Here, the locals had their turn to set the table. They played patient, staying high but not too fast, baiting the surrogate to commit to a second pass before fully resetting. On signal, both defenders broke in opposite senses, 1 high, 1 low, forcing an angle choice. The attacker took the high element, got a short sight picture, and then, correctly, refused the flat turn that beckoned. But by then he had paid the turn tax twice in a row. Now the locals nudged him toward that one narrow corridor where mass and momentum help less than hinge friction and wing loading. He felt it and left. Good, the test pilot said on the ground later, chalk squeaking a compact diagram. Your goal is not to win in one exchange. It is to make the other pilot enjoy the least helpful sky for the next exchange. They closed the morning with a short classroom period. He brought out a single page with 4 sentences at the top. Count to 4 at the bottom. If you're still pulling for the vertical on 5, you are paying interest without income. Break once, then decide. A second break without a plan is just a smaller version of the first mistake. Tax turns, not dives. Each forced heading change at moderate speed is a coin in your pocket. Don't buy the ladder. If the other pilot wants to climb while you stare at his tail, you are solving the wrong problem. He left space below for local notes. Pilots filled it with weather cues, transit altitudes, even landmark silhouettes that meant don't climb here. The wind bullies you at this hill. Tactics, in the end, are geography with verbs. News of the session spread through the wing. Not a proclamation, a rumor of utility. A day later, a section leader who hadn't attended asked for a copy of the 4 sentences. Another borrowed the chalk sketch and turned it into a wallet card. A maintenance chief, overhearing the brief, added a practical point. If you expect to fight in the vertical all day, check control cable tensions like a violinist checks strings. Slack hides at the worst time. Everyone in the enterprise owned a piece of the result. The official channels moved at their own speed. A sanitized excerpt of the August report appeared in a circular marked guidance, High Performance Adversary. It carried no airplane name and felt as if it had been translated twice. Even so, the bones remained. Avoid coaltitude chases, prefer single decisive breaks, protect the top. Some readers recognized the origin and smuggled the missing muscle back into the words when they briefed. Others preferred the old sheets with familiar diagrams. Habit is a pilot too. Meanwhile, the test program marched on. He flew a stubby interceptor that loved to sprint but tired quickly upstairs. He flew a sleek prototype whose gauges impressed until a bump of rough air asked a question the spars couldn't answer kindly. He wrote, always the same way, what it does, what it wants, how to live with it, how to live around it. He learned to avoid 2 temptations, falling in love with novelty because it was new, and disliking it because it wasn't yours. The air doesn't care where you were built. On a grey afternoon, he visited the archive room to confirm a small figure from his notes. The clerk, a careful man with an ink-stained cuff, asked quietly, "Do you suppose any of this changes outcomes?" The test pilot thought for a moment. "It changes some," he said. "That's all anyone can promise." One crew comes back with a story that contains a lesson, and the next crew leaves with that lesson in their pocket. That is already the world being slightly different. That night, a letter arrived from a squadron near the coast. 2 pilots described an encounter with a high, fast opponent that attempted 2 passes. The first they barely spoiled. On the second, they executed the exact break once and rise to deny pattern he taught. The attacker extended and chose not to re-enter. "We did not shoot anyone down," the letter read, "but it felt like we kept our place at the table." He folded the paper and put it with a small stack he kept, the only trophies he allowed himself, instances where a line on a board had become a line in the sky. Autumn narrowed the daylight and sharpened the air. Cold changes machines. Oil thickens, controls feel wooden until everything warms, and any airplane that relies on marginal thrust at height becomes honest in a new way. The test pilot used the season to revisit a few comparisons. In chilly, dense air near the surface, the nimble type sounded happy and leapt into their preferred games. Up where breath frosted the inside of a mask, the heavy radial surrogate still made height out of speed with the same calm confidence. He wrote a short addendum to the August notes. Temperature baits you. Don't let a lively takeoff convince you that upstairs has changed its mind. A request arrived to prepare a compact energy primer for unit instructors. 5 minutes of concepts without equations. He drew 2 axes and labeled them height and speed, then showed how each maneuver spends one to buy the other. He added a third, invisible axis, time. That was where the Corsair-like profile changed everything. Most fighters could draw a nice rectangle, dive, pull, turn, climb, if you gave them all afternoon. The Bluebird drew the same rectangle faster and kept drawing it while others were still tracing the first corner. "This is why patience at the top pays outsized dividends," he wrote. "You are not simply away. You are ready again before the other machine is finished with its last choice." He emphasized, too, the moments when eagerness sabotages advantage. A vertical fighter that tips too soon, rolls into the re-attack before finishing the climb, gifts the defender the one commodity that matters, breathing space. Conversely, a horizontal-minded defender who turns twice without checking the clock wanders into an ever-shallower pool. He phrased it gently, "Look at your watch with your eyes." The instructors smiled at that and underlined it in their copies. December brought a brief thaw and with it an opportunity to run a mixed-force practice with a visiting group. They simulated a bomber stream with escorts perched above and attackers coming in smartly from ahead and from the sun side. The goal wasn't to crown a champion, but to test small instructions under the weight of many airplanes sharing a sky. On the first run, the escorts did what many had always done, stayed glued to their chargers, bleeding speed to stay visually present. The attackers ignored them, flitted through the flank, and picked at the rear elements. On the second run, the escorts used the primer, operating as a detached counterweight. They stayed tall, traded one clean dive for one honest break, then reclimbed without guilt. Now the attackers had to choose, and in choosing, they slowed. The bomber crews, played by pilots seated at tables with radios, grinning at their roles, reported the difference plainly. Fewer calls of someone behind me and more of I heard them come and go. Back in his office, the test pilot received a thin envelope bearing a stamp from the Capitol. Officially, it thanked him for his thorough comparative observations. Unofficially, a penciled note in the margin, clearly added by a friend along the route, read, "You are not wrong, you are early." He tucked the page beside the letter from the Coastal Squadron. Early is only useful if it arrives before habit makes a decision expensive. Through all of this, the captured airframe remained a quiet presence on the ramp, flown only enough to keep systems honest and to answer one or two lingering questions about handling with a slight load. The mechanics liked working on it. The hardware was robust, the layout straightforward, the fasteners willing to come off and go on without drama. One evening the chief fitter, a man who measured respect in the way he wiped tools, said, "Some airplanes are hopeful. They ask the world for a kind day. This one is prepared." The test pilot wrote that down, too. It explained in one sentence what pages of climb charts tried to say. He found himself, increasingly, teaching the psychology of restraint. The great trap of a big engine, he told a room full of fresh faces, is that it flatters you into thinking you can circle down and finish every time. That's how energy fighters lose their advantage. You are not in the business of finishing. You are in the business of not needing to. It felt counterintuitive because it asked for controlled ambition, not conquest. But the pilots who adopted it came home sounding less breathless and more amused. That, too, is a statistic. As winter deepened, so did the institutional tension between truth and convenience. Some commands embraced the guidance. They redistributed patrol heights, altered rendezvous points to protect an escort's reset turn, and rewrote scramble briefs with explicit clauses about not chasing the ladder. Others preferred to keep schedules unchanged and talking points familiar. When a doctrine has served you for years, it feels disloyal to see it trimmed. The test pilot learned to accept an old rule. You cannot make a tree grow faster by shouting at it. You can, however, plant enough good seeds. He also kept learning. A visiting naval aviator, captured months earlier and now a quiet consultant under careful watch, offered a gem about carrier habits that applied to land war, too. We plan by cycles because decks force rhythm. Strike, clear, refuel, strike. The Corsair fits that. Hit hard, go upstairs, and get your breath, come back. It's not aggression, it's cadence. The test pilot thanked him and added cadence to his board next to timing and choice. On a clear afternoon, he took up a two-seat trainer with a young officer who had never climbed above 6,000 meters. They went to the top of their allowed block and simply watched the world shrink into a map. "This is where the blue one lives," the test pilot said through the intercom. "And anything that lives here for long changes your habits down there." The young officer nodded and later, on the ground, drew his own rectangle on the corner of the primer and wrote, "Make them speak your language or end the conversation." Letters continued to arrive, short notes from units that had started using the 4 sentences as a standing item in briefs. One reported a case where a section leader aborted a tempting chase because his wingman said softly, "Don't buy the ladder." They waited, climbed together instead, and the attacker, finding no easy angle, slid away.
No traïemph.
Just 2 airplanes returning with fuel to spare and a lesson that would ride along on the next launch. The test pilots slept well those nights. Not because outcomes were fixed, nothing in that season felt guaranteed, but because the work had become plain. Carry accurate words from the hangar to the map, from the map to the brief, and from the brief to the sky. Machines come and go. Physics keeps its habits. And a good sentence, repeated enough times, becomes a habit, too. Snow arrived like a quiet edit to the landscape. Edges softened, sounds damped, the field lights glowing in small halos. Winter flying drew different lines on the graph. Density was a friend at takeoff, bite in the prop, lift in the wing, but the upper reaches turned brittle. Instruments lagged if you didn't baby them. Oil reminded you of chemistry. Breath turned to lace inside a mask if you forgot to rebalance the flow. The test pilot used the season to validate the cadence idea under harsher conditions. Could a heavy radial type still draw that quick rectangle, dive, one firm pull, reset, when the air fought back with cold hands? The answer held. Yes, provided you honored preparation. Warm the cables. Stage the throttle. Do not yank when you can smooth. The airplane paid you back with the same quiet authority. He took notes in a tighter hand to fit more on each page. The primer grew a winter appendix. Cold hides lag in systems. Anticipate 2 beats earlier. Brief your pull-out altitude with a margin you will not negotiate. He underlined the last clause. Vertical flying works because timing is crisp. Timing is crisp because you set guardrails. Requests kept coming. A Northern Wing asked for a 2-day syllabus that would let its instructors teach the energy game without a captured showpiece on the ramp. He arrived with a canvas bag and rolled out simple tools. 2 wooden blocks to represent altitude and speed, a string to show vector, a pocket metronome to give rhythm. He set the metronome on a stool, tick, 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 and said, "This is the rate at which the opponent rearms his next choice. Your aim is not to be dramatic. Your aim is to act between ticks." They worked with chalk, with sticks and snow, with low passes that never pointed at anyone. The metronome served as a strange comfort. It turned the sky's uncertainty into a count you could hear. On the second morning, he let the students design a scenario. "We want to save a slow element crossing a gap," the senior instructor said. 1 tall escort, 2 mid-escorts, attackers likely from sunside. The test pilot added only constraints: a defined lid, a true floor, and a recovery line beyond which no one would be lured. They flew the drill 3 times. In the first, the tall escort came down too soon, seduced by a good sight picture. He scored a simulated hit but arrived low and out of cycle, leaving the mid-escorts to juggle 2 problems at once. In the second, the tall escort refused the early shot, drew the attacker out of his preferred room, and climbed until the metronome said go. The dive, when it came, was short, clean, enough. The slow element crossed the gap without raising voices on the radio. In the third, they reversed roles. The attackers tried a staggered entry to where the tall escort thin. That worked, once. On the next repetition, the tall escort adjusted, timing his rectangle so that one reset overlapped both threats. "A rectangle is a shape," he said later over tea, "but it is also a promise. Finish it every time and the other side runs out of clean angles." Back home, bureaucracy found him again. A polite directive asked that future reports emphasize pilot morale outcomes alongside technical observations. He smiled at the phrasing and complied, interviewing crews after each training block. Morale, he learned, wasn't a poster feeling. It was a set of specific cues: air under the wings when you expect it, radios less crowded with fear, gas remaining when you touch down, a memory of having chosen rather than stumbled. He began to score briefs on that scale. An energy brief that saved time and lowered radio volume earned 5 stars in his notebook. The captured aircraft itself required attention beyond flying. Salt from its sea voyage had nested in seams. The maintenance crew decided, on their own, to strip and reseal the worst corners. They used local sealant and an almost tender patience. When they were done, the test pilot took the chief fitter for a circuit. They climbed to a polite height, ran a short dive climb pattern, then came back. The fitter climbed down smiling. "It feels tight," he said, patting the cowling. Machines hear that kind of care, the test pilot thought, and respond in kind. There were limits, and he wrote those down as firmly as he wrote advantages. The radial's joy upstairs came with cost in time to altitude from a cold start. Scramble math had to reflect that, or you'd ask an airplane to arrive early to a party it could dominate if it simply walked in on time. The vertical style punished indiscipline ruthlessly. A single greedy pull could turn a planned reset into a long wallow, and a long wallow into a crowded radio. He began closing lectures with a short refrain: "Make the easy things automatic. Save your brain for the one hard choice per minute." 2 letters that month mattered more than the rest. One from a coastal flight described a dawn where a high opponent probed twice, failed to draw a chase, and left. "No fireworks," the leader wrote, "only the quiet pride of not buying a story." The second from a ground controller who had changed his calls. "Fewer urgent vectors, more reminders of ceilings and clocks. They sound calmer," he wrote. "It's contagious." Doctrine lives or dies on those small crosslinks. Air chooses differently because ground speaks differently. Ground speaks differently because air sent back a sentence worth repeating. On an evening when the windsock hung like a tired flag, he pulled out his earliest Corsair notes and reread them. The clear line had not blurred. This family of machines, here physically, there in principle, earned its reputation not by magic but by making energy where others leaked it, by converting speed to height and back again with fidelity, by refusing to be lured into scenery that made it ordinary. The lesson had spread beyond a single model. Units were teaching cadence now. Young pilots were learning to hear their metronomes. The day ended with a small kindness. A cook from the canteen, who had never flown, handed him a folded paper, a sketch she'd made from a hill, tiny chalk-like rectangles in the sky as the formations rose and drew their shapes. I watch for the moment when the quiet one goes up and just waits, she said. That's when I know you're winning. He thanked her and tucked the drawing into his folder between the Capital's stamp note and the Coastal Squadron's letter. Evidence, of a sort, that clarity travels in more ways than reports. By late winter, the field had memorized its own sounds. A bullish radial rolling to life, a slim inline clearing its throat, the brisk clack of a step ladder being moved under wing. The test pilot's calendar filled with an odd mix, formal trials with stopwatches and chalkboards, impromptu clinics when weather cleared, and quiet office hours where he translated the sky into sentences for people he might never meet. A message arrived from a training command inland. Could he compress everything into a single standard-hour brief that any unit could deliver before a mission cycle? He accepted the challenge. The hour began not with charts but with a story. 2 choices, each reasonable, one that spent energy without buying position, one that bought position without burning options. He showed no diagrams for the first 5 minutes. He watched faces ease as pilots realized this wasn't about humiliating old instincts, but about giving names to moves they already half knew. Then the hour unfolded in clean segments. 5 minutes on heights you can afford, 5 on speeds that build again quickly, 5 on angles that do or don't return your investment, 5 on reset rituals, 5 on exit lines, and 5 on how to skip a shot you don't need. He left 10 minutes for local weather and airspace quirks, ridges that created false lift, valleys that funneled wind, towers that trick the eye. The final 10 minutes belonged to voice. He wrote 4 calls on the board: reset high, pass short, no turn, ladder bait, ignore, rejoin for top. Units could tailor words, but the ideas were fixed. Call the plan, not the panic. He flew out to deliver the hour twice, then left behind a packet with an invitation. Change nothing in the packet except the parts that don't fit your sky. Within a week, a copy returned with margin notes from a mountain squadron. Our floor must be higher because downdrafts here play rude at this altitude. Increase reset altitude by 500 meters. Perfect. The standard hour had done its job when it encouraged the next hand to write. Meanwhile, the captured machine received one more focused exercise. The mechanics had found a way to simulate a modest external load without risking structure. The test pilot wanted to see if the rectangle held its crisp corners with the added drag. The answer: the shape remained, but the metronome ticked slower. He adjusted his guidance. When carrying, make the first dive steeper but the pull shorter. Keep the climb shallower but longer. Same music, he told the class, different tempo. He resisted the urge to dramatize. This was not an epic, just a change in count. A small crisis tested the narrative. During a local defense drill, a section leader with new enthusiasm for the vertical made 2 clean passes and then, drunk on rhythm, tried a third without the reset. The third turn grew flat, the radio grew busy, and a clever opponent slid into the one blind slice the heavy nose still couldn't see. No one was harmed. The lesson was loud. In the debrief, the leader held up a palm. My fault. I tried to make the rectangle a circle. The test pilot offered only one line. Music stops when the band runs out of breath. Don't force an encore. Everyone wrote it down. Another letter from the Capital arrived, less polite than the prior one. It asked that he avoid predictive statements that may reduce offensive spirit. He read it twice, then composed a reply that contained no predictions at all, only observations. When we keep altitude and time discipline, our radios sound like this. When we don't, they sound like that. He included 2 anonymized transcripts, calm spacing versus layered urgency. He attached the metronome, a small joke. The answer came back with no comment, which he took as approval or indifference. Either would do if units kept using the hour. The Coastal Squadron sent a dispatch that made him grin. They had created a tiny badge, a blue rectangle with a white arrow, awarded for the rarest of victories, a refused chase. It seems odd to hand out a badge for not doing something, the note read, but our pilots smile when they earn it, and they keep gas in the tanks for the parts of the day that really need it. Culture is doctrine without a memo. He clipped the badge to his board with a paperclip. Spring teased the field with one warm afternoon and then took it back. On that warm day, he ran a side-by-side comparison with a local favorite, sleek, quick to roll, happiest when carving level arcs. They agreed on a shared block of sky and alternated rolls. When the sleek one forced the fight low and flat, it painted elegant loops that the radial could not quite match. When the radial kept things tall and straight, it drew staircases the sleek one could not quite climb. The score, if you insisted on one, was a draw. The real result was better. Both sides knew the other's joy. In the debrief, he asked the simple question, where would you rather live? Most pilots will fight hard to defend their hometown. The test pilot set aside one morning each week for reading. He returned to early memos where experienced hands had dismissed twin-engine fighters as clumsy, radial brutes as farm tools, naval birds as specialists. Nobody had been malicious. They had simply reasoned from the skies they knew. He penciled in the margins. Context picks winners. It wasn't a rebuke. It was a map legend. On a quiet Sunday, he walked the line alone and stopped at the captured machine. He remembered the first day, salt on its seams, skepticism in the hangar, the feeling that he was meeting a rumor. Now the rumor had been turned into sentences and drills and small, sturdy habits. The airplane's reputation no longer felt mystical. It felt like craft, mass managed well, power spent wisely, height treated as a savings account instead of pocket change. He ran his hand along the edge of the wing and thought of all the rectangles traced in unseen air over fields and seas. The last task that month surprised him. A transport unit, large, slow, perpetually left out of fighter talk, asked for a microbrief. They did not expect escorts every time. Could his hour help crews by themselves the best odds when alone? He visited their hangar, climbed into a cockpit that felt like a living room, and talked to different music. How to present less planform to a diving attacker, how to adjust climb schedules to deny an easy second pass, how to coordinate with ground stations to time their own small rectangles, short descents to cold layers, turns toward gaps that forced an opponent to widen. When he finished, a captain said, "You just taught us the same thing but with our verbs." He nodded. That was the whole point. Every evening he folded the day's notes into the leather file that had grown fat since August. He knew none of this guaranteed safe returns. Weather writes its own edits. Luck still wanders through any plan. But he also knew that clarity had a way of multiplying. A sentence becomes a brief becomes a habit becomes a quiet change in how a sky feels when many machines inhabit it at once. And somewhere, perhaps far away, a pilot in a blue machine climbed, paused, waited out the heartbeat, and then traced a neat rectangle that made everything below a little tidier and everything above a little more honest. That, he thought, was enough reason to return tomorrow and move the chalk one line farther. The thaw came in patches, wet lines along the taxiway, a brighter tone in the engine notes, jackets unzipped one notch. With it came visitors. A river base unit from the east arrived in a ragged string, paint dulled by winter grit, minds sharpened by long escorts where nothing went quite to plan. They asked, politely but plainly, for the vertical primer without the preamble. He gave it to them standing on a fuel drum, chalking an invisible staircase in the air and tapping his metronome on his palm so they felt the count rather than heard it. Then, instead of flying the showpiece first, he put those visitors in front while he flew chase high above, watching whether their spacing preserved the rectangle or bent it into an oval. The first sortie proved honest. One element accelerated cleanly, delivered a short, centered pass, and climbed away on schedule. The wing element, stirred by the sight picture, pulled a fraction too long and lost bite at the top. He did not correct on the radio. He simply waited until they had landed and, beside the wingtip, traced the lost altitude with his hand. "You can buy a photo or you can buy position," he said. "The invoice arrives either way." No one argued. The second and third sorties tightened like fresh drumheads. When the river base unit departed 2 days later, they left a tin coffee tin stuffed with their own checklist cards, dog-eared and annotated. Count 3 before you squeeze. Leave room for a roll if the picture widens. Fuel is a vote, cast it upstream. He kept the tin on his desk. Doctrine isn't a monument. It's a communal pencil. A wire from the Capitol arrived with a flatter tone. Please provide a brief comparing energy-style escort to the more familiar lateral weave. He took no sides in the writing. He praised the weave where it belonged. Low, close, when shielding a point you must not yield. He praised the ladder when the horizon was wide and the day had height to spare. He drew 2 boxes on the page and wrote, "Choose the box that fits the room you are actually in, not the room you wish you had." The reply came back with a stamp, "Distributed." He smiled. Even cautious institutions can be nudged by a sentence that doesn't demand a confession. Up north, one coastal unit began sketching rectangles on their ops board before takeoff. Not grand art, just a stack of short lines aligned with the wind arrow, annotated with the day's lid and the day's floor. A young controller noticed something funny. The more rectangles scribbled on the board, the shorter his transmissions became. The pilots were finishing their moves without being told. He wrote a note to the test pilot. "It feels like watching people walk a staircase they built together. My job is just to remind them what floor they're on." The note went into the leather folder. He kept flying the captured machine, though less for theatre now and more for calibration. He wanted to be sure familiarity hadn't softened his sense of its edges. One cloud-dusted afternoon he climbed to a kind ceiling, eased the nose over, and let the speed run only until the controls began to speak in that thickened way heavy airframes do. He pulled exactly as much as he had briefed himself on the ground. The altimeter unwound and rewound like a measure repeated in a song. When he landed, he wrote a single line. "When what you planned on the ground is still what you choose in the sky, the airplane feels like a teammate." It was not poetry, it was a receipt. Letters kept coming from places he would never see. A mountain unit reported that their standard hour now included a weather slide that was just 4 words: ridge, rotor, rule, retreat, but every pilot could speak to each word in detail. A transport captain wrote that the microbrief had turned into a ritual. Before dawn, a quiet walk around the airframe, one hand on the skin, 1 minute visualizing the 2 most likely exits if a fast silhouette appeared above the horizon. "We don't feel heroic," the captain wrote. "We feel prepared." He underlined prepared. There were missteps, and he treated them as tuition rather than scandal. A squadron, overeager to live upstairs, launched into a day that never truly opened. The lid sat lower than forecast, the clouds stitched shut the middle bands, and eager rectangles became cramp hats worn too tight. The debrief was calm. They built a new habit. If the lid remains low after the second circuit, transition to weave and save the lecture for tomorrow. He wrote that as a footnote in the standard hour. Good doctrine includes its own escape hatch. The mechanics, who had adopted the captured machine as a sort of shop emblem, began keeping a little log of their own, a feel book. It wasn't maintenance in the formal sense. It recorded how the airplane sounded after a day of humidity, how the brakes warmed on long taxes, how the prop governor liked to be greeted on cold mornings. The test pilot loved it. "Every fleet," he told a staffer, "has 2 libraries, the formal one in binders and the living one in pockets." He asked permission to photocopy 3 pages and slip them into his primer as an appendix titled "What the Airframe Tells You When You're Listening." He tried something new with a class of younger pilots. He gave them the hour in reverse. He opened with the exit calls, then the reset cues, then only at the end did he show the staircase. It worked better than he expected. When you know how you will leave, entering becomes gentler. Later, over a late meal, a student said, "It felt like being shown where the door was before we sat down." He wrote that, too. Across the spring, he noticed a small but real shift in radio tone across units who had adopted the cadence. There were fewer breathless stacks of words and more short confirmations. Reset high. Passing. Hold ladder. Silence where silence helped. Language is fuel. Waste less of it, and brains stay cooler. He could almost hear morale in the empty spaces. One afternoon, an old friend from a design bureau visited, the kind of engineer who treats wings like sentences and rivet lines like syntax. They sat on crates with their backs against the hangar wall, watching the rectangles sketched faintly by contrails. The friend said, "You've turned a reputation into a rehearsal." The test pilot nodded. "And the rehearsal into something crews can teach without me." He did not say the other thought out loud, that this was the real measure of any lesson, that it walked by itself. Summer's first clean heat returned, and with it the long horizons that make vertical flying feel almost unhurried. The calendar filled less with demonstrations and more with maintenance of a culture, revisiting units months later to see what had stuck, asking instructors what they would cut from the hour without regret, swapping examples across fields like chess openings traded between friends. He began collecting tiny proof points, the kind you can't show on a map but you feel in your shoulders. A controller who used to pace during heavy traffic now sat and annotated calmly. A new leader who inherited a nervous flight found the group's pulse within 2 sorties by insisting on the reset before any pursuit. A mechanic who had once rolled her eyes at pilot theories now drew 3 rectangles on a scrap and said, "Here's where the engine likes to sing." None of these were dramatic. All were anchors. He also shipped a small package back to the capital. 2 pages titled Plain Language Doctrine for People Who Don't Fly. It explained the ladder in metaphors anyone could own: a lifeguard looking down from a chair, a cyclist who coasts to keep momentum, a conductor raising a hand to set tempo before the orchestra joins. He wasn't trying to charm headquarters. He was trying to give them handles. Ideas travel farther when they don't require translation at every door. The captured machine kept doing its quiet work. They had flown it enough now that its quirks felt like familiar street corners rather than traps. The heavy nose that once intimidated on the ground had become a reminder. Weave gently when you can't see. The stall that arrived too suddenly for lazy hands had become a mantra. Do not slow down in a room that prefers speed. He had stopped being surprised that crews stepped down from the wing and spoke of it as if it were a colleague rather than a trophy. It had earned that. On a cloud-high day, he flew a last extended rectangle, not for show, but for calibration of his own judgment. He set a clean starting altitude, wrote a target pull-out number on his kneeboard, and promised not to bend that number for a prettier picture. The dive was smooth, the pull a single, even movement, the climb long enough to feel the metronome tick twice. When the altimeter returned to the kneeboard number and stopped there like a friend arriving on time, he felt the quiet satisfaction that had brought him to this work in the first place. He landed and wrote 1 line: "Trust is the distance between plan and behavior." Requests slowed. That was good. It meant the hour belonged to others now. He found more time to sit at the back of rooms while instructors he had trained taught their own versions. He learned as much as he corrected. One had turned the metronome into a hand clap. Clap, reset, clap, pass, clap, rejoin. Another had drawn a set of tiny ladders on cards and used them as cues during debriefs. A third had taken his 4 voice calls and shortened them to 2. "Economy," she said with a grin. "We are in the business of fuel, even on the radio." He applauded. He wrote 1 more memo to the capital, not a treatise, just a page of bullet lines. Choose your fight by choosing your room. Reset is not retreat. It is the price you pay to keep choosing. A clean overshoot you decide to let happen is a gift you will open 1 minute later. Teach exits first. Courage grows when pilots trust their way out. Keep 1 ritual that belongs to the ground crew. Machines fly better when the people who nurse them feel seen. He did not expect a reply, and none came. But 6 weeks later a visitor from a far field carried a photocopy of the page, folded and smudged. "We keep this by the kettle," she said. That was better than a stamp. He visited the river base again, not to instruct, but to watch a mission from the map table to the last wheel chirp on landing. Rectangles were drawn on the ops board with less ceremony now, almost absent-mindedly, the way experienced cooks season without measuring. The brief was pared down to muscle and bone. In the air, the picture was tidy: short passes, unhurried resets, a flat radio. The leanest moment came when a sleek opponent tried to pull them into a flat. Showy loop. No one bit. The escorts paused at the top of their climb until the clock in their head said go, then came down just once, barely long enough to make the point, and climbed again. The opponent left. On the ground, nobody bragged. They put the airplanes to bed and went to tea. That, to him, was the face of mastery: quiet. He knew better than to pretend the rectangle solved everything. Weather still argued. Luck still wandered in late and uninvited. There would always be days when plans bent to fit a sky that refused to cooperate. But he also knew that a roomful of crews who had learned to count the same way could improvise together without shouting. That was the true gift of the hour, a shared rhythm. On his last flight in the captured machine, he invited the chief fitter along for a gentle circuit. The fitter had never flown in it, had only felt it through wrenches and palms. They climbed in smooth air, leveled, let the prop hum at a civil pace, then made 1 polite, small rectangle, so small it was more a gesture than a maneuver. Back on the ground, the fitter sat on the wing a moment longer than needed, looking out over the field. "It is satisfying when the work talks back," the fitter said. "When it says thank you by behaving." He nodded. Machines and people share that language when you take care of them. He put his leather folder on a shelf and wrote the simplest closing page he could manage. If you took anything from this work, let it be this: choose the room that favors your strengths, by your position with patience, finish your shapes, keep one ear tuned to quiet, and leave every airplane and every brief a little clearer than you found it. The rest is practice. The rest is rhythm. The field returned to its ordinary routines, the honest ones that win long contests, fueling, wiping canopies, swapping stories that contain more craft than swagger. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a pilot lifted into a wide morning and, meeting a decision at altitude, chose the clean reset over the glamorous chase. No applause followed. But 2 minutes later, at the top of a climb, that same pilot looked down from a room of their own and saw a picture that made sense. And that, more than any headline, was the legacy of a single season spent turning a reputation into a repeatable rhythm, one rectangle at a time.